Time to say a very good morning to Mr. Peter Hitchens. Peter, how the devil are you?
Well, so far so good, but
Excellent.
pretty miserable about the political and economic and general situation, I'm afraid.
Well, it's bad news, isn't it, when the only news you get to talk about outside of COVID-19 turns out to be Brexit, which we'd all got bored with about a year ago.
Yes, it's about to become quite unboring, though, I think.
Well, what do you make of that? Let's kick off with that because we haven't. And welcome, by the way, for the first time onto Zoom, so people can now see you in all your glory as well as listening to you. What's your fear about what happens in 38 days then?
Well, my fear has been for some time, as you possibly know, I didn't take any part in the referendum or vote in it. My fear has been that we were making a very considerable mistake by not following the Norway option, that is to say, staying in the single market and chucking out all the political rubbish. And I'm sticking to that. I think that when you become what the EU calls a third country, that's somebody who's trading from outside, the consequences are wholly predictable, but could be absolutely enormous. And I've never understood why people didn't look more carefully at the Norway option to see that many attractions. And I still treasure a tiny hope that between now and December the 31st, somebody will dust it off and say, hey, why don't we do this?
Yeah. And what would you see as the advantage of the Norway option then?
Well, I say that the principal advantage of it is quite simple. You don't have any political control or direct legal control from the European Union. It's obviously a big neighbor. You have to pay attention to it. And if you want to live there, you join the single market and you stay in it, as they do, while, say, not having the political interference in their fishing grounds or their oil industry or any other things where it's none of the EU's business. And that always seemed to me to be the perfect compromise between the position we were in and the position that we're going to be in. And I still think so. And I'm just stood amazed at the way so many people have just never paid any attention to it or taken it up.
No. Well, most of the people that I've seen commenting over the course of the last, say, 24 hours or so, in terms of our listeners, are quite happy to leave without a deal altogether. Because I've always argued that in the end, surely we'll always be negotiating at some point with somebody about something. You can't sort of suddenly sign a piece of paper and expect nothing else to happen other than for trade to run very smoothly. You're kind of always going to be negotiating something, aren't you?
Well, I suppose so, but looking at this particular government, I don't anymore comfort myself with the idea that we must eventually reach a sensible compromise. I'm not at all sure that they understand how to do that, or indeed, in many cases, they actually know what would happen if they failed to do so.
Yes.
I don't think it will happen either, because it's a land of mystery. Once we leave the European Union and leave the single market at the end of this year, which we will in reality, a lot of people think we've left already, we haven't. Once that happens, and maybe half of Kent will be covered in lorry parks, and maybe there will be a more or less shutdown of large parts of our trade with the European Union, not of them sending stuff to us, but of us trying to get stuff to them, and the resulting chaos which follows. I just think that it's no one, ever since the stories of takeover by Dominic Cummings of the Leave campaign, and the replacement of what had been a campaign to re-establish British sovereignty with a campaign for the wildest notions of free trade, the whole Leave cause has been very different from the one which I thought I belonged to before the referendum happened. And that's one of the reasons why I parachuted out of it. I didn't like the look of what was coming, and I still don't.
But you presumably would still prefer to be out than in, wouldn't you?
Well, yes, but I don't think it's not necessary. As I say, Norway proves, Switzerland proves it in a different way. We couldn't negotiate that, it would take decades. But Norway proves there is a way of taking the economic advantages of the EU without taking the political interference. It's not perfect, but I absolutely promise you that what's coming after December 31st won't be perfect either. So that's not really the argument.
Well, I suppose not, but I mean, a part of the big part of the problem is that people have been speculating for weeks and months and years now about what terrors may await us. And generally speaking, on all of the things that they warned about before, they weren't right. So I tend to veer on the side that actually it will probably be a lot less bad than you think it's going to be, because up to now, all of the things that we were warned were going to happen and we're going to destroy the country and destroy the environment and destroy the economy haven't happened yet. And you're not allowed to say that's because we haven't left yet.
Well, in that case, they won't say that.
But you know what I mean, though.
Well, I know what you mean, and indeed, it would be a delight to me if the worries which my great friend and ally, the late Christopher Booker, expressed on this, who was one of the greatest experts on the whole European issue, wrote the book on it, and knew more about it, I think, than anyone else living. I'd be really pleased if his worries turned out to be unjustified. But I have to say, I think Christopher understood very clearly what was going on, and if he thought that the plunging out of the single market without, as we appear to be planning to do, was going to be a disaster, then I'm inclined to think that he might have had a point. All prophecy is dangerous, and he's now not around to redouble it because, alas, he died last year. But it is the case that he, who really understood this issue and had written many books about it, thought that leaving the single market and becoming a third country was hugely problematic, and I have to say I have to respect that.
And as far as the kind of the union is concerned, what are your thoughts about that? Because obviously one of the things that we are told today could become a problem is the Northern Ireland situation regarding, freedom of movement of goods and services and all the rest of it. But also you've got Nicola Sturgeon up in Scotland, you've got the Welsh Assembly over in Cardiff, both kind of agitating, if you like, against almost all government policy now. And will there be a price to pay for Downing Street on that in terms of the way that the union will be maybe potentially broken up as a result of how we leave the EU?
Well, this has always been a crack into which the European Union could insert a lever, and the breakup of the United Kingdom was actually one of the consequences of our joining the European Union, which doesn't really like to have rival federations on what it regards as its territory. There was a huge competition between the Federation of the United Kingdom and the Federation of the European Union. But what the particularly Scottish independence is largely about is Scotland switching fealty from London to Brussels, and the whole creation of devolution, largely by New Labour, but not really fought on principle by the Conservatives, was a response to the loss of sovereignty of this country to the European Union over many years. I'm not sure that can be reversed. As for the position in Northern Ireland, I'm certain it can't be reversed, because what this country actually did in 1998 was sign a surrender to the provisional IRA, and which will ultimately come fully into force. And Northern Ireland is very much a provisional, to use an appropriate word, a provisional member of the United Kingdom. I don't think it can last.
We're just losing you a little bit there, Peter. But let's get off the subject of the European Union. Let's get back to the matters at hand, because over the course of the weekend there was some interesting stuff written about the testing procedures that are currently undergoing in the country, in terms of the fact that more and more people are being tested. We've got a figure of more and more infections. People saying it's alarming. Now we've got the biggest number of infections in the thousands since May. What we can say, though, is that an awful lot of the testing is responsible for an awful lot of the results that we're seeing, which is what you've always said anyway.
Well, yes, this morning I bunged in a question to the Department of Health saying, well, could you please give me the figures or the numbers of tests which have been taking place since late August for each day, the numbers which came back positive and the numbers which came back negative, and the others which were discarded and excluded for whatever reason. And I'll be very interested to see that. But I can't really believe that a jump in so-called cases that was recorded last night could happen without some sort of major change in the way in which this thing is being recorded. I expect strongly that the government has stepped up the amount of things to it.
Well, I think there's no doubt about that. But also, interestingly enough, they've now started to, or certainly some medical people have started to sort of weed out what's going on here. And they've started to echo your words, which are that, one, yes, there are more people being tested. Therefore, yes, there are more people testing positive. But equally, those people are not necessarily ill. And we know, for example, from the Leicester lockdown, that there were no additional hospital admissions, despite the fact that they had a rampant number of people testing positive. We also know that of the last, say, month or so, we have not had any numbers of deaths increasing or any numbers of hospital admissions increasing. So surely the government has to now put all of that into context.
Well, you would hope so. But the people who really need put it in context, the large majority of the British media, particularly the BBC, you can listen to major BBC programmes, such as the Radio 4 Today programme, and you wouldn't get any sense at all that anybody working there had any idea that these were interesting questions. It doesn't seem to cross their mind that more tests mean more cases. It doesn't seem to cross their mind to wonder what a case means. I was supplied by a correspondent with a number of graphs last week showing the paralleling the number of tests and the number of deaths. There's no relation between them, and the number of people going to hospital is tiny. And so the whole idea of saying that a large number of tests means that we're on the edge of a terrible new outbreak of death and misery is simply false. But you wouldn't know it from reading many newspapers, and you certainly wouldn't know it from listening to or watching the coverage of the main broadcasting organizations in this country. And this is absolutely disgraceful. I say to my fellow journalists, what is it that you're doing? Did you leave your brains somewhere? Can you remember where it was? And if you can't actually be basically skeptical and critical and mistrustful of government state, what are you doing in the trade of journalism anyway? You're not suited to it. I think this has been one of the greatest failures of journalism that I've ever seen in my life.
Yeah.
And a totally disgraceful one. I look forward next March to everybody in my trade congratulating themselves on what a wonderful job they did when they did nothing of the kind. The only awards they deserve are awards of shame.
Yes, you're absolutely right, Peter. I mean, I'm like you, similarly taken aback, because I would never normally be critical of my fellow colleagues and people that work in the business that we are both in. But I have to say that ever since really the referendum, I've been quite taken aback and staggered by the bias that's been shown by the BBC, which they're now admitting even amongst themselves, the bias that's been shown by Sky Television and even ITV in the form of Robert Peston, the idea that they are somehow anti-government and yet they don't ask the right questions. And you do wonder why that is, because they seem to have moved now from the list of deaths being the highest in the world and how terrible it all is, to now that they seem like encouraged by the fact that infections are up, like it's a good thing.
Well, I know. It is very difficult to explain, but I think I'm trying at the moment, I'm trying to write something about what exactly is going on. And I think the real problem is that quite a lot of people like being afraid. Quite a lot of people like handing over responsibility. They don't like taking it. And fear is a wonderful opportunity for doing that. If you're sufficiently afraid, then you've got an excuse to run to mummy. And basically, a large part of the population in this country has run to mummy. And mummy turns out to be Matt Hancock, which is not necessarily an attractive prospect for some of us. And that's what they've done. They've found that they don't really like being free. They don't really like being free to question. They don't really like having independent lives. They like being told what to do. And it is a minority of people who don't. I mean, this is a question. I know you disagree with me about this, and that's why I think we should discuss it. The question of these muzzles that people are being made to wear. Increasingly, with another case, which I only just saw on Twitter, a man who appeared, from all one could see, to have been behaving perfectly normally, being handcuffed in a supermarket car park by about 4 police officers for not wearing a muzzle. And the scenes in Victoria, in Australia, and particularly in Melbourne, when there was a small protest against this last Saturday, were absolutely appalling, especially when one remembers that the state of Victoria basically has the same legal and political system as we do. It's now something rapidly approaching a dictatorship in which the state prime minister is ordering people to stay at home for most of their lives and sending people round to burst into the homes of those who protect.
Yes, no, I saw the pictures from Victoria of the police officer seemingly putting a mask on a protester without their without their permission, effectively.
Yeah, well, this is. I said this is not about. It's not about health. This is about fear and power. And I think those members illustrate this. And I do draw people's attention to the pictures which, in fact, my newspaper, to its great credit, originally published some years ago, of the prisoners at Guantanamo who've just been unloaded from the plane, kneeling in chains in their orange jumpsuits. You look at those pictures, and what do you see? Those Guantanamo prisoners who were being held wholly unconstitutionally, extraordinarily, and still, to me, very wrongful behavior by the United States, what were they wearing apart from the orange jumpsuits and the goggles and all the rest? They were wearing those little blue muzzles over their mouths. Can anyone tell me that anyone had heard of COVID when Guantanamo was set up? And they were there. They knew what they were there for. They were a symbolic gagging, and that's what they were wearing them for. And I think people should look at those pictures and wonder how it is that exactly the same pieces of pale blue cloth have turned up now, and they're putting them over their mouths.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, funnily enough, I haven't checked out. I've seen the video on Twitter. I haven't actually looked at it of the guy being arrested in the supermarket. But I'm always slightly wary of the stuff that appears on Twitter without checking it out. Because, for example, the one of the guy who was being sort of manhandled on a train up north somewhere by a police officer who was complaining that he didn't want to wear a mask. Apparently, there had been a report, according to the police. Now, you could say to me, well, we don't believe a word the police say. But according to the police, there had been a report that this guy was spitting at people. Therefore, you could understand why they were on the train. Now, I had my first taste of it. You may be interested to know. Last Thursday, I took the train into work. I took the tube into work, and I walked through the ticket barrier with my phone, because my phone is my facial recognition scenario, which gets me through the barrier. And there were two police officers standing on the other side who said, excuse me, sir, do you have a mask? And I said, yes, I do. I'll be putting it on when I get on the train. And one of them muttered as I walked away, you should be wearing it in the station. To which I said, well, I'm not going to. And I just kept walking. And they didn't come after me. But as far as I know, there's no absolute law which says you have to wear one in the station. I'm quite happy to wear one on the train, but not on the platform.
Oh, I'm afraid you're dealing with an expert here. Alas, the law does now say that you should wear it in the station, except in Wales, where it's only on the train. And you talk about the Merseyside episode, and the police did indeed put out two statements. One that there had been reports of him spitting on other people, and others have been reports of him coughing. And I wrote to them on Twitter and said, which is it? I don't think I've had a reply. Right. And it was interesting in the scene that was recorded was there was no sign of the officer reproaching the man for having coughed or spat over passengers, or even raising the issue. He was wholly concentrating on that he was wearing the muzzle. And the other passengers, who, if he had been doing this revolting thing, would surely have been joining in on the side of the police officer, were not saying, oh, that disgusting man was coughing on the other passengers. They were saying to the police officer, what exactly was he doing? Right. So, although we haven't seen everything, I think so far it does look to me as if something very heavy-handed was going on. Remember, this is a police force which not very long ago was under severe criticism because it just doesn't bother with things like burglary and car theft and no longer patrols the streets. Now seems to be joining in with immense enthusiasm in handcuffing citizens who will not wear face muzzles. And I don't find that particularly reassuring.
No, I don't. No, I agree with you. I mean, I can't imagine a scenario whereby 3 years ago you and I could have had a conversation in a pub in which we would have said, "Oh look, there's a guy coughing over there. You better call the police." It doesn't really make a lot of sense, does it?
No, it doesn't. It's a complete change in the nature of things. Talking to some friends the other evening about this, and one of them said, now, for large parts of this year, I've been afraid to go out in case I got in trouble with authority. This is an extraordinary law-abiding person, actually a former criminal lawyer, right? And very absolutely and totally against crime and not inclined to commit it. So suddenly becoming afraid of being picked up for something which has suddenly become an offence. It reminds me also of some of my trips, particularly to the People's Republic of China, when I went to Xinjiang to see what was happening to the Uyghurs, which is now a huge issue, wasn't much known about. And you did feel, particularly in the city of Urumqi, a great sense of nervousness that whatever you were doing, although it was entirely legal and I was there legally, I haven't broken it, at any time, I didn't want to attract the attention of the police in case they decided that for some purpose of theirs, I was someone they could pick up. It was a similar sort of nervousness has now begun to creep in this country. Well, this country should not feel like the People's Republic of China. And half the point of being British is that you don't live under the circumstances where you have to be afraid of authority. Authority really should be afraid of the people. That's the only proper arrangement. And that's what's shifting now. People are becoming afraid of and far too obedient to arbitrary authority. You know the Milgram experiment, the great experiment where people were persuaded to give other people electric shocks because authority told them to do so. In a way, what's going on is this country is being subjected to a huge, great Milgram experiment in which the government finding out just exactly how obedient we are. If they suddenly said that all COVID viruses floated at 3 foot 6 inches, or they'd probably say a meter above the earth, and we all had to go on our hands and knees, how many people would obey?
Yeah, well, that's what I find staggering. And yet, I mean, we're out of time, so we can't get into it in a big way. But and yet, if there are enough of you, and you wish to perform some act of civil disobedience, such as bamboo chaining yourself to some gates or a lorry or something to stop newspapers coming out, that's okay. You can do that.
I think it's the right sort of disobedience, it is, yeah, otherwise not.
No, quite. Exactly. Peter, great to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed. And good to see you as well. Peter Hitchens on Zoom for the first time, a Mail on Sunday columnist, man who says, as I do, what has gone wrong with the people of this country? Because in the end, it's the people who run the country, not the government. And if people are actually genuinely frightened to go out because they're worried they might be breaking the law, then surely there's something wrong with that, isn't there? For heaven's sake, we need to get back to work. We need to get back into the city. We need to stop doing what we are told every single second of every single day, because the more that you do that, the more that you will be told what to do. That's the way it works.